Dr. Dale Allison, welcome back to Theology U, where we talk to academics and authors about God and faith in a way that anybody can understand. Thanks for coming on the show now for a second time.
Happy to be back, Will.
Today we're talking about a book that you wrote that just came out. I think it's a brag for me to say that I have a copy in my hand because it's so recent, called Interpreting Jesus, and particularly chapter 3 called Everywhere a Miracle. Could you talk about just kind of your basic argument, what you're talking about here in the book, Interpreting Jesus, and with Everywhere a Miracle, just where you're going with this, and then we'll go from there.
Okay, so first of all, some general comments about the book. This book is like my other books on Jesus. It's not a systematic presentation of who he was. It's not a systematic presentation of his teachings. It's not intended to be a biography. It's a collection of studies on subjects that I think are really interesting and that have been important historically for the academic guild, for the scholars who study Jesus. So you couldn't say there's a main theme to this. I'd like to think that it's just really interesting stuff about Jesus, who's a really interesting and important figure. The chapter on miracles was a lot of fun to write, and I'm really interested to see how people respond, or maybe perhaps they will just ignore it. But it starts from the fact that almost everybody who tries to explain or account for the miracle stories in the Gospels takes one of two strategies. So one strategy, of course, is the strategy of the skeptic or the post-Enlightenment doubter who says miracles don't happen, therefore we have to have other explanations for them. So the skeptics then have different explanations for different stories that do not require anything really out of the ordinary, anything not known to modern science or modern psychology. On the other hand, you have traditional Christians who simply assume that many of these miracles took place as recorded and that the obvious, in fact, only explanation is God. So you have a sort of all or nothing. It's God everywhere or it's nothing everywhere. And I've been dissatisfied with this for a long time. It has to do with my own worldview. And here's the problem that I will run into, because most of the people in the guild don't share my worldview. Even though I am a Christian, I'm an idiosyncratic Christian. So when it comes to miracles, I actually prefer the term metanormal events, by which I mean things that are not ordinary, but which I think still happen. And their relationship to God or divine intervention is, for me, very often cloudy or not there at all. So let me give you an illustration of this. So let's take the Transfiguration event, which occurs in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Jesus goes up on a mountain, and then he glows. And the skeptic would say, well, maybe they just made up this story because Moses glowed and Jesus had to be like Moses or greater than Moses. Or maybe at some point the disciples saw Jesus standing at the top of a mountain and the sun was rising behind him, and they were naive and interpreted this as a vision. So you have what you would call reductive explanations of this. Or on the other hand, you have Christians who would just say, well, he was divine and God is light, and here is a manifestation of Jesus's divinity. That's a theological explanation. Now, here's my problem with that. I'm an historian, and I'm also somebody who's been walking through life now for several decades, and I've read lots of stories and heard stories from people. And so I don't think that if Jesus glowed, that would be a one-of-a-kind event, or that if Jesus and Moses glowed, that would be two events, and that's the end of it. So if you look at Roman Catholic canonization records, they are full. That's not hyperbole. They are full of people saying, "I saw Teresa of Avila, glowing in her cell," or "I saw so and so glowing in his cell." But you also, if you read widely enough, can find Sufi masters who glow, or Tibetan masters who glow. You can find holy people, whatever that means, in multiple traditions, glowing. Now, again, the skeptical approach is just to say, well, these are legends or misinterpretations of optic phenomena, something like that. But I've read enough not to believe that. And for example, I have a friend who is a Sufi, and he has told me the story of how one afternoon he had an audience with this man, just one-on-one in a room by themselves. And this guy started just out of nowhere glowing and got brighter and brighter and brighter, and his light filled the room. And then, without any explanation, it just simply sort of died back. Okay, so that's a friend, somebody I talked to, could interview about it, judge his credibility, and so on. Then several years ago, I had a son who, with 3 people, had an audience with a Tibetan holy man, with one of the, a 90-year-old revered figure that was the head of his Tibetan lineage and so on. So somebody that was very, very revered. And my son told me immediately after it happened that as they were sitting here talking to this guy through a translator, he started glowing. And my son is a modern person, so he looks around. Is this light coming through the window? What the heck is going on? He tries to understand it. And he decides after a little bit, no, this guy is glowing. He doesn't say anything about it until, of course, he gets out of the room and he says, "Did you all see what I saw?" And they all say, "Yeah, we saw this guy glowing." All right. Now, maybe I'm wrong, but I think that this can't be that rare of an experience, because I know 2 people who have told me about it. What are the odds of that, right? So if 2 people I know think they've seen this, then this must be not that infrequent. And if you read the right books, they will catalog stories of people, usually Roman Catholic saints here in the West, who people thought glowed. Now, again, maybe there's some mundane explanation. If it exists, I don't know what it is. But I know that people have such experiences, however you or somebody else wants to account for them. My son thinks this is real. All right. Now, if I have enough of these stories, and if I even have some that are collective, like the incident with my son, where more than one person, then I look at the story in the Gospels and I can say, well, I can't prove that this happened, but if it did happen, it wouldn't astound me, right? It actually fits into a type of event that is, if you know where to look, actually pretty well attested. Now, here's the problem with this. The problem is that historically, people in religious traditions have always interpreted metanormal events, or what they might call miracles, as sort of proving the truth of their tradition. That's why, for example, when the Protestants show up in the 16th century, they deny all Roman Catholic miracles, because if they think any of them happened, oh my goodness, that would show that the Roman Catholics are right about something. So skepticism in the modern world actually starts with the Reformation, which says, we after the New Testament, we can't believe any of this stuff, right? So they slay all those medieval miracles, and they don't like anything. The problem with that for me, and again, I belong to the Christian tradition, but the problem with that is that there are simply lots of attestations of many sorts of miracles that just come from eyewitnesses, and they're not latent legendary. And many of these people are of sound mind. They otherwise don't make crazy claims. And in some cases, with some saints or some people, you just have multitudes reporting on a particular thing, right? So, probably the best known event, which has got a lot of attention in the last 20 years, is a 17th century monk named Joseph of Cupertino, an Italian monk who was seen by, well, thousands of people over 4 decades to float or to levitate or whatever it was he was doing. And testimonies, signed affidavits were taken from people during his canonization process, people who saw him and swore to God, blah, blah, blah. People went and saw him, Protestants who converted to Catholicism after seeing this guy. So so what you're hearing from me is not what you normally hear, but this is my worldview. I think sometimes people glow. By the way, that's an odd one because the people who glow tend to be holy people, right? I don't know what that's about, but it just doesn't happen to ordinary folks. I think sometimes people levitate. I am sure, whatever the explanation, it makes no sense, that people sometimes see things before they happen. I believe I myself have two occasions over the course of my life, seen things in detail before they happened, things that I could not have foreseen or guessed. They were really odd events, things that have happened only once in my lifetime and shortly before I beheld them somehow. Okay, so where's all this going? My way of approaching the Gospels is through a historical analogy. So if you go through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you will find about 24 cases in which Jesus knows what's going on somewhere where he is not. So people call that clairvoyance, all right? I've never had that experience, but I've read enough to believe this is fairly common. It's fairly common for a mother preparing dinner in the middle of cooking something to say, oh, something just happened to my daughter. And then to find out 5, 10 minutes or an hour later, yeah, my daughter was just in an accident, right? But somehow she sensed this from afar. Okay, now whether you think I'm right or not, this is my worldview. So what I'm getting at here is that I think you can argue for the plausible historicity of a number of things in the Gospels that skeptics just dismiss because they're supernatural, or that Christians just instantly say, oh, that's God. He must have been God, so that's why he could do this. I think that we don't have to fall into either camp, and that actually, although I want to do theology at the end of the day, I don't think it takes theology or Christian belief to say, yeah, Jesus could have foreseen things once in a while, or he could have known things that were going on, and he might even have done some of the extraordinary things like glow that are in the Gospel. So I'm arguing through analogy. All right, I'm arguing through analogy. There was a Harvard medical historian who wrote a couple of books recently where she investigates stories of miraculous healings associated with Roman Catholic saints. And it's very interesting. I admire her. She says, I'm an atheist, but I have to admit that there are many stories of people being healed that make no sense to me. So I do not invoke God, but I'm humble enough and open-minded enough to say these appear to be extraordinary events. And, she doesn't have a God to explain it. She just says, okay. So my hope is maybe someday we could try to think historically, and we could say some of these things may well have happened, regardless of our theology. All right. So I'm trying to build public arguments here,
Hmm.
arguments that don't require being a Christian. So if you are a Christian, you'll say, yeah, of course, I have faith in the Gospels. Jesus was divine, was the Son of God, and so on. So he did all this. My claim, which again will be strange to most people, is that I think you can argue for the history of at least a good body of this stuff without having theological convictions. Um, by the way, David Friedrich Strauss is probably the best known skeptic of all time, who wrote a very famous book on Jesus in the 19th century that cost him his job. Uh, and he was very, very skeptical about the Gospels. But in one edition of his work, he thought, oh, I've seen people who have clairvoyance. So maybe Jesus sometimes did know things from afar. So this is the great skeptic. This is the great skeptic saying, well, maybe some of these stories could go back to Jesus,
Hmm.
but he was not a traditional Christian at all. Didn't have a conservative axe to grind or apologetical axe, and I think Strauss was way too skeptical. But it's really interesting to me that he could, because of his worldview, still look at some of these strange passages and say, well, that could be historical. So I've rambled on here for quite a while, but maybe that's the gist of what I'm doing in that chapter.
Yeah, thanks for that. I have a bunch of thoughts, many of which are I'm curious how people are going to react to the chapter because I find it interesting, compelling, at the very least, honest and worth thinking about. So what I want to hear more from you about is there's the clairvoyance, there's the, telepathy
Uh
or
huh.
glowing or levitating, but there's also in the gospels walking on water. There is, like you mentioned, healings. There's the feeding of the 5,000. And it seems to me like almost all these miracles are presented in parallel, as if I'm supposed to read them along the same lines, which I think leads to that. What you pointed to earlier is I'm either going to read all of them and take them all at face value, or I'm going to say, oh, I think this is all funny business. So, how do you distinguish, like, which ones am I supposed to take
Yeah.
literally? Which ones am I supposed to trust, and which ones am I supposed to think maybe there's some fudging going on? Because it seems to me they all kind of seem like this just happened, and believe it is like the bare bones reading.
So first of all, I don't know everything, and I'm frustrated by my own limitations. I think scholars often have too much faith in themselves. They often think they're Sherlock Holmes and they can prove or disprove, whatever happened or didn't happen. I don't think so. I think what we can do often is just say that could have happened, or that's plausible, or there's no reason not to believe it. That sort of thing. Now, at the end of this chapter, I do a sort of exploration of the nature miracles. And I say, well, as an historian, here I'm putting my theology off to the side. As an historian, how might we think about these things? And what I have observed is that some of the miracles in the Gospels, or unusual things, are really almost a dime a dozen. So clairvoyance and telepathy, I think, are almost everyday events with certain individuals. Glowing, it's not an everyday event, but the evidence for it is rather amazing once you look into it. It's all over the place. But the number of stories of people multiplying food, they're actually there. They're there, I know, in the Hindu tradition. They are there in the Roman Catholic tradition, but it's not like they're everywhere and all over the place. These are rarer events. And walking on the water is even rarer. So if you're going to do analogical thinking, which is what I'm trying to do here, I would have to say, well, speaking as an historian, I'm much more confident about the telepathy and clairvoyance than I am, for example, about walking on the water, because the analogies are fewer and farther between, and they're not as well attested, and so on. So I could see somebody saying, yeah, these miracles, but not those miracles, on the basis of historical analogy. As for the healings, though, I think that Jesus was a healer, and I think that there were probably amazing healings. And this is also very well documented, not just in Roman Catholic literature, but in modern secular literature. There's a name that we have that they have for it: spontaneous remission. So when something happens and it has no explanation, it's spontaneous remission. Although almost everybody who is seriously ill is praying to get better and has people praying for them. So how do you decide what is divine intervention and what is spontaneous remission, right? I don't know how you do that. But there are the attestation for amazing healings is there. And also the psychosomatic component to healing is really well attested. So if you add those two together, I don't have any trouble saying Jesus must have been a healer. He drew crowds. There were people who were convinced that he had healed them. But of course, how do you show that any particular one story is accurate in its details there? I don't have the arguments, the same confidence in arguments. How would you show that, this particular event actually happened as narrated? But if you're talking in terms of generalities, I don't have any problem with Jesus was a healer, and not only would some of it have presumably been psychosomatic, but some of these would have been what you would call miraculous or beyond normal explanation. So,
Yeah.
That's how it works. There's sort of some things are really well attested, and some things are genuinely rare.
Yep. You mentioned the feeding of the 5,000 example, and the potential rational explanation. I think in the chapter 1 that you mentioned from somebody else is that Jesus, has a little bit of food and he's very generous with it, and that incites everyone else to be very generous, and suddenly everyone's fed.
Uh-huh.
And I think, okay, I mean, I can't disprove that.
Yeah, you can't
But when I
disprove that.
read the story in Matthew 14, it seems like the food is truly multiplying. And it seems like that's what I'm, supposed to believe. And I believe that it could happen, right? If I think miracles can happen, there's nothing that stops Jesus as God from doing that, even though it doesn't make sense. But I can't
Well,
prove it, right? I don't know.
you can't prove it, although I have to say that I'm puzzled by some of the testimony to multiplication of food in some of the Catholic records. Some of them, including some from the 19th century, are
Mm,
really, it's really hard to know what to make of them, right? By the way, you referred to Jesus as God there. That's really interesting because I have a excursus or appendix after the chapter,
mhm,
and I just say it's worth thinking about the work of Bulgakov, who's a Eastern Orthodox Russian uh, theologian, and he wrote a lot about miracles, and he had a really interesting take, which I think is consistent with where my thought is heading or the direction it's been heading. And so he now you have to remember that Bulgakov is Orthodox, and so he's grown up with the stories of the saints, the Eastern Orthodox saints, and they do lots of miracles. It's like John, you will do even greater things. Well, some of them did some pretty spectacular things, right? Okay, so he believes that uh, the saints have done things that Jesus did, and then he goes on to say it's a heresy to teach that Jesus did miracles because he was divine. The way he thinks about it is that his divinity made his human nature perfect, and a perfect human nature has abilities that belong to Eden,
mm,
belong to human beings beyond this fallen world. That Jesus was actually displaying human nature as it is intended or as it can be. There's a really interesting, fun thought to toy with, so I thought I'd put that there just so people could think about this. But it does fit the circumstance that I can find parallels to most of these things all over the world, And I can find parallels to most of them, even in secular or non-religious contexts. Once in a while, you know, amazing things just happen without a religious context. So he's given me cause to think about this in a different way.
Yeah,
And
that's
let me just add as a footnote.
mhm.
Uh, Moses does really fantastic things, but nobody says Moses was God because, you know, he parted the Red Sea or commanded the plagues. Those are really spectacular. And I note, I'm not sure Jesus does anything quite as spectacular as parting the Red Sea. So you can have, in the Christian tradition, people who do miracles, and you don't say it's because this person is God. And the other thing, closely in connection with this, is the Bible recognizes that miracles don't authenticate the miracle worker in and of themselves, because the magicians in Pharaoh's court, they can do half the things Moses can do, right? What's that about? Or the Antichrist will do great signs and wonders to lead people astray. Or um, Paul, if you know I can move a mountain and have all faith and do all this stuff, but I don't have love, who cares? Matthew 7. Some of these people said, Lord, Lord, and they did great marvels in my name, but I don't know who they are. So even the Bible itself doesn't regard miracles as, you know, a sort of absolute proof. They have a context. There's a moral dimension to them, the theological dimension. Um,
Yeah, for sure. Even like Simon in Acts, Simon the magician,
oh, huh?
you know, he's got a big crowd of people who think this guy is awesome. He's doing miracles, and then as soon as the early church meets him, you know, they're yelling at him saying you're the worst, and you know, rightfully so.
Yeah. Well,
I think that's why your point is good to separate like miracles as like a universal proof of any one tradition, and to say this is the only way I can believe anything is if you show me miracles. I think even you see Jesus says that, like they ask him for more signs, and
yeah,
he'll
yeah.
say, if you don't already believe, you're not going to believe with one more miracle.
You know, the Gospel of John has this language about signs, and it's really interesting because sometimes the signs should compel you to think, wow, there's something really amazing going on here. On the other hand, they're sort of relativized, and blessed are those who, you know, the see or believe without seeing, and so on. Uh, so, yeah, miracles can be ambiguous. Also, I have to add a footnote at this point because I have evangelical friends who sometimes worry me here. Of course, I worry them, so uh, it's even. But they frequently think that if a miracle has happened outside of their own tradition, then it must be Satan. So they're working with God or Satan. Anytime anything out of the ordinary happens, it's God or Satan.
Mhm.
I think that's very limited. I also think it's very dangerous because that's what opponents of Jesus do in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They say, "Oh, he's casting out demons. Oh, what do we do? Oh, well, it must be Beelzebul. He's in league with Beelzebul." So that's the strategy that was used with Jesus. I'm very allergic to that because it's so easy. It's just my miracle is a miracle, and your miracles are demonic.
Yeah. So
That
what do you think's what's your way of explaining it then? And if it's not, you know, if you
oh
want to get away from that, this or that, how, what do you say instead?
Well, so I think that there are erratic possibilities in human nature that we don't know much about. I also think there are things like time that we don't understand at all. I've read philosophers on time and physicists on time, and I put their books down and say I don't know anything. They don't know anything either, right?
Hmm.
So, what does it mean to see the future? I actually have no idea. Do we live in a block universe that can explain this, or is there something else going on? I honestly don't know. Why is it? I think that when people enter certain psychological states, and I would say certain spiritual states, some weird things happen, and that this can happen in different religious contexts. So
Hmm.
uh, the answer is I don't have an answer. I just have certain random thoughts that I think when I'm pondering this issue. But I do think that there are certain human abilities that we don't that just manifest once in a while, and are erratic, and people don't have control over them. Uh, but then there are these people once in a while who seem to have a number of, uh, they seem to attract weird events to themselves or even have some power of their own, right?
Yeah, interesting. So then what distinguishes for you Jesus from other religious people? What still sticks out about Jesus? What makes him
Well, so
separate or unique enough that you still want to hold on to your Christian faith?
so there are two ways of answering that. One would be through a sort of apologetic, philosophical, or theological reasons for believing in a God and a certain
Mhm.
sort of God, and but I have to be honest, and I think at the end of the day, when I'm introspective, uh, and I think about things, this I just have to say, for whatever reason, historically, psychologically, the Sermon on the Mount functions as my conscience, and I'm totally fascinated by the passion narratives, especially Mark 14, 15, and 16. They just draw me in like there's something magical here. It's the same thing with the parables in Luke, and it's the same thing with what I might call the mysticism of the Gospel of John. So, as a matter of fact, these things are part of me. They, I can't get away from them, and I see no reason to get away from them. I suppose if you were to prove to me tomorrow that there could not be any God of any sort of theistic reality, then I'd have to rethink things. But I'm not in that place. So your question is a good one. I'm not sure I know how to come up with all the apologetical answers, but I don't know who I am if you were to take this figure away and the things that this figure has produced. Um, so that's not really an answer. It's just being autobiographical.
Yeah,
Um,
and again, I appreciate the honesty. Do you want to keep going?
yeah, just one more thing. So there are also certain people that I love, and I love their spirit, and I love their thoughts. And at least in my experience, a large number of these have been Christian. Both people I've known I've had to have good fortune of knowing several semi-saints. I also have found that there are certain Christian thinkers like Origen and Gregory of Nyssa and Pascal and Isaac of Nineveh who simply make sense of the world for me. So when reading certain Christian thinkers, I say, yeah, that makes sense. That fits the world as I experience it, and sometimes also, yeah, I want it to be that way, or I wish it would be that way.
Okay. I want to ask you about another thing you mentioned in the chapter, the Lady of Zeitoun, which was new to me. Once I read it and I looked it up, you think, okay, there people have been talking about this. Could you explain for someone who's never heard of it what that is and why you thought it was worth including?
So I think it's possible that this is the best attested religious miracle or alleged religious miracle in history. So 1968 through 1971, in a suburb of Cairo known as Zeitoun, um, at a church known as St. Mary's, uh, I think it was April 1968, some people were standing on the street opposite of the church dome, the big church dome, and they looked up and they thought they saw a woman who was going to jump off the dome. And so one ran to get a police officer, and one ran to get a priest, Coptic priest, and somebody yelled up, "Don't jump, don't jump." But at some point they realized this figure is kind of glowing, and there's really no footholds on the dome. It's a pretty steep dome, right? And somebody looks up and says, "Ah, it's Mary." I guess it's natural. It's St. Mary's Church, right? Uh, and what happens is that this figure, this lighted figure, appears over this dome or moves around a bit between the domes. Uh, very, very often. Um, Usually at least twice a week. And this became such a big event that the government officials tore down a bunch of trees around St. Mary's, and they actually destroyed some buildings because there were so many people. Now, you know how hard it is to count crowds, but people will say, well, it originally started with 10,000 people and it was 20. Some nights it was over 100,000 people. Well, I don't know how you count these things, but tons of people came, so much so that the city built a fence around this and set up seating for it so people could come and look. Most of the people who saw this were Muslims who have a place for Mary because of the Quran. There's a passage in the Quran which uh, sounds like a bit like Luke 1 has entered into the text. So they have a place for the piety of Mary. She's a friend of God. And the Coptic Christians are Orthodox, so they have a Mariology. She's the Theotokos, the Mother of God. And this just took hold immediately. This must be Mary. Um, there are some photos from the time, and I actually have a book that was published in 1969, and the photos look the same as they do now. So, you know, if they were doctored with, they were doctored with right at the beginning, okay? But the point about this is that this went on for a long, long time. There were secular journalists who went to see this. There were Protestants who went to see it. Uh, and if you read the firsthand testimony, we have literally thousands of interviews about this. There are still lots of people in the world. Here in New Jersey, we have a Coptic diaspora. There are lots of people here who, as children or young people, saw this. In the Coptic Church, this is a major event in Egyptian church history. This is a big deal. I think it's a big deal because I don't think there are any good explanations for it. That is, I don't know what the materialistic or reductive explanation is. I don't think it's earthquake lights. I don't think it's mass hallucination. I don't know what it is. And it's the kind of thing that you can look at. And if you're a Coptic Christian or Roman Catholic or Greek Orthodox, you could say, this is Mary. I mean, it's a slam dunk. What else is it? And if you're not Orthodox, I think you should say that is a something we know not what. We have no explanation for this at the current time. Look, the city officials, they cut off the electricity to the grid that the church was on, and the lights were still there. People searched the church looking for things. There isn't any good explanation for this. There's a book that just came out. I think it's called The Marian Apparitions at Zeitoun. And it's just full, the middle part of the book is just full of firsthand testimony. And if you read it, you either say, gosh, this must be Mary, or what the heck is this? I don't see any other option. So I like this because it aligns with the sort of thing I'm doing in the chapter that we've been talking about. I think that you can rationally give this a theological explanation and you can say this is Mary. I also think you can say, well, something real was going on there. This is a genuine series of events, even though I can't explain it. But the one thing that doesn't make sense for me would be to say nothing happened, or it's mass hallucination, or earthquake lights, or or it was fraud. Somebody perpetrated a hoax. Those are just bankrupt explanations.
Yeah, it's such an interesting example. I think primarily because, well, for a lot of reasons. One of which it's pretty recent. The
Uh-huh.
photographs are very compelling, as well as just the sheer number of people that went and that it lasted for years, essentially.
Uh-huh.
I think it's just I mean, I agree with you. It's hard to give an explanation other than I don't quite understand what's happening here. Does that, so like, it? I'm a Christian. You're a Christian.
Hmm?
My tradition doesn't, we don't spend a lot of time thinking about Mary,
Yeah.
but of course, think Mary was awesome. That event feels to me apologetic. It makes me feel like, oh yeah, of course, the Holy Spirit is still doing stuff that we don't quite understand, and the spiritual realm is real. It's somewhat comforting for me to think, oh yeah, God is still alive and active, and here's this great example. Does it have any kind of similar effect for you, or do you just see it? Does it do something different, or is it just a historical event, or is it one of 100 other things that you think of? I'm just curious, like how that kind of event strikes you,
So
given your worldview.
Zeitoun has made a big impression on me because I first ran across this in a book in the late 1970s, and then I was able to get a book that was published in 1969. I don't know how the heck I got it, but I have it. And then another very early book. And then I've read about it occasionally from time to time and looked at things on the internet. And uh, I've told people I'd be delighted if it's Mary. It wouldn't bother me at all. Uh, I can't do that as an historian, but as an historian, this fascinates me. Here, I think we have a major event, a major public event, for which we don't have an explanation, but we could, if we wanted to, plug it into a theological world and have some sort of explanation. Uh, I've been honest with people. I'm like you. Uh, I don't know. I don't think about Mary much. She doesn't have a large part in my piety or my Presbyterian tradition here at the seminary. So I just say I don't know what to do about it, but I have to say it fascinates me. It keeps drawing me back. I I read through this recent book that came out on it, trying to think again what what might this mean. I wrote a chapter on Zeitoun actually in a book on the resurrection of Jesus, in which I said I think this should caution us against a sort of easy skepticism or assumption that we can immediately think, oh, okay, we have in our debunking toolbox, these things, and we can take this down easily. I don't think this is easily taken down. So I think it should be a caution for skeptics. Maybe I'm missing something, but I've been looking for a long time, and I just don't know what the
Mhm.
easy reductionistic explanation is.
Yeah, I think caution for skeptics is well said. I think that's a good point. And you mentioned the resurrection. I I don't want to talk about miracles without at least touching on the resurrection, which does end up being kind of the grand finale, right? This is the miracle of all miracles in the Jesus tradition, and something that does distinguish him from, the idea that he raises himself from the dead, or that the Spirit raises him. It's not Elijah raising somebody else.
Uh huh.
Um, how again? I know you've written a bunch on the resurrection. We could do another 5 hours talking about um, the resurrection. I'm just curious how your understanding of miracles ties into that event, which for me, with my evangelical upbringing, feels massively significant. Jesus
Well,
um, being raised from the dead, distinguishing himself, conquering death, feels like super central to me, and it would be very, very difficult for me to let go of. So I'm just curious how in the context of the miracles, how you would then, think or want to think about the resurrection.
so look, I wear multiple hats. Maybe we
Hmm.
all wear different hats or play different roles. So as a theologian, you have to say this is central. You have to say that without it, there probably is no Christianity at all, or maybe a handful of people remembering some things that some wise guy said, but or some wise teacher said, but that's all it's going to be. So the whole religion grows out of this, and this is the climax of the Gospels, all four of them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And Paul says it's, the foundation of things. So there's no way to get around that, and I don't want to get around that. Um, Having said that, I also have this historian's hat. And so I have to ask, well, how do I have public arguments about this, right? And again, the only way I can have public arguments is to construct arguments that people outside my theological tradition can understand and evaluate. So what you're going to have to do there, and I did it in my book, for better or for worse, I said, what sorts of analogies can we look at that help us to understand what's going on here or might help us to understand? So one of them was Zeitoun, which is a collective apparition or appearance of something that seems to be really there. What does that teach us? I had a controversial chapter on Buddhist rainbow bodies, and that very weird tradition that sometimes the Tibetan holy people will shrink, after death, or once in a while they just shrink away. If this is true, what would it mean? If it's not true, what would it mean? I spent a lot of time looking at apparitions and visions, because Acts calls Paul's encounter with Jesus a vision, a heavenly vision, right? The Bible is full of visions, and some of the weird things that happen in the Gospels don't sound like Jesus just walked in through the door. If you read John 20, it doesn't sound like he opened the door and walked in and then opened the door and left. It sounds like he pops in and out, which is what, apparitions do. So I did my best to say, well, are there any good analogies here? Are there any, good analogies here or there? And, at the end of the day, I'm not reductionistic, but I argued that there were enough parallels of some sort with certain real events to make plausible the idea that there are real events underlying these stories that we have in the New Testament. So, a Christian at the end of the day is going to have to break off doing analogies at some point. But again, if you're going to be an historian and you're going to think publicly about things, then I don't know how you do anything other than analogies. That's just how all historical thinking works: what's plausible and what's implausible, what happens and doesn't happen, and so on. I'm fortunate that I think lots of things unusual happen. That makes my collection of analogies or parallels much bigger than it is for other people.
Yeah, thanks. That's helpful for me to hear. Thanks so much again for your honesty. I really enjoyed the chapter. It's thought-provoking for me. Parts of it I love. Parts of it are really difficult for me, and I think that's good. I think that's a good thing. So thanks for sharing. Thanks for being honest.
I'd like to end, if I could. Could I end
Yeah.
with a quotation that I began the chapter with? This is a quotation from G.K. Chesterton, which I love very much. I think he knew what he was talking about. It'll sound strange to many people, but I'd like to read it. Insofar as the church did, chiefly during the corrupt and skeptical 18th century, urge miracles as a reason for belief, her fault is evident, but it is not what Mr. Blatchford, his debating opponent here, supposes. It is not that she asked men to believe anything so incredible. It is that she asked men to be converted by anything so commonplace. He's talking about miracles. He believes they're everywhere. He doesn't think they're the basis for Christian theology. He just says, yeah, they're all over the place. I think he's right. So theology clearly works with much more than miracle stories, right? So, and Christian philosophy has to do the same thing. But when we do talk about them, I think we can't run away from the interreligious parallels. We just have to, and the secular parallels. We just have to be honest about that. So I agree with Chesterton.
Same. So do I. And I guess that means I agree with you. So I think that's where we should stop. Thanks so much for coming back on. I look forward to maybe our third episode in another, 3 or 4 months if I'm lucky. Thanks so much for coming back on the show. It's been great.
Thank you.